So here we are, late March 2026. I was sitting in my home office scrolling through three simultaneous live feeds: Al Jazeera Arabic, Iranian state TV, and a grainy telegram channel from southern Beirut when it hit me. Not a missile, though there were plenty of those flying around. What hit me was a thought, the kind of thought that crawls under your skin and refuses to leave. The thought was this: we had just witnessed, in real time, the single most consequential geopolitical event since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and most of the Western world was busy arguing about whether Trump's claim of talks with Iran was real or fake. Let me back up. Let me take you through what actually happened, layer by layer, because the story they told you on CNN and the story that actually unfolded on the ground are two entirely different animals. One is a press release, the other is a civilizational earthquake. On February 28, 2026, a date that will be carved into the history of West Asia the way June 28, 1914 was carved into the history of Europe. The United States and Israel launched nearly 900 strikes on Iran in 12 hours. 900. Let that number breathe for a moment. That is not a surgical operation. That is not a targeted strike. That is an attempt to erase a nation's strategic infrastructure in a single night. They hit the IRGC headquarters, they hit the leadership house, they hit air defenses, radar systems, naval installations. And here is where it gets both tragic and telling. They hit a girls' school adjacent to a naval base, killing roughly 170 people, many of them children. And in the opening salvo, they killed the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, Ali Khamenei. Now, I need you to understand something about the Western strategic mind, because it explains everything that followed. The assumption, the deep, almost theological assumption, inside the Pentagon and inside the Israeli security establishment was that killing Khamenei would trigger either paralysis or collapse. They had studied Saddam's Iraq, Gaddafi's Libya, the Taliban's Afghanistan. The playbook said, remove the head and the body dies. Regime decapitation. It is the oldest trick in the imperial handbook, dating back to when Rome would eliminate tribal chieftains on the Rhine and expect the Germanic peoples to simply scatter. But Iran is not Iraq. Iran is not Libya. Iran is a 4,000-year-old civilization with institutional memory deeper than anything Washington can compute. And this is the part of the story that genuinely surprised everyone, including, I suspect, some people in Tehran. Within 8 days of Khamenei's death, 8 days, while bombs were still falling, while the Arab state broadcasting complex lay in ruins, while parliament itself had been targeted, the Assembly of Experts convened, and they elected Mojtaba Khamenei, the son, as the new supreme leader. Now here is where most Western analysts completely lost the plot. They looked at this and saw dynastic succession, a father passing power to a son, Middle Eastern strongman style, like Assad in Syria, or the Kims in North Korea. Trump himself called the new leader lightweight and said he would not last long. The Israeli establishment echoed the sentiment. But this reading is not just superficial, it is dangerously wrong. What actually happened was something far more complex and, frankly, far more impressive from a pure institutional standpoint. The IRGC, the top military brass, the political leadership, Galibaf, Larijani, Pezeshkian, all pledged allegiance to Mojtaba in the middle of an active bombing campaign. Think about that. A nation under the heaviest aerial bombardment since the opening days of Iraq 2003, and its institutions performed a constitutional leadership transition without missing a beat. The Assembly of Experts had itself been targeted by Israeli strikes on March 3rd during a preliminary meeting. They reconvened anyway. This is not the behavior of a state on the verge of collapse. This is the behavior of a system that was built from the ground up to survive exactly this scenario. And this brings me to the most misunderstood aspect of the entire conflict, the question that nobody in Washington or Tel Aviv seemed capable of asking: why is Iran still fighting? Because by every conventional metric, Iran should have been finished. Trump stood before cameras and declared that Iran had no navy, no air force, no radar, no air detection. Admiral Brad Cooper of CENTCOM announced that 5,000-pound bunker busters had been dropped on underground missile storage facilities along the coast. The U.S. military claimed it had struck over 1,000 targets. Israel said it had destroyed Hezbollah's infrastructure in Lebanon as a bonus. The narrative was clear. Iran was done. And yet, Iranian ballistic missiles kept hitting Israel. Not just hitting, they broke through Israeli air defenses in the south, slamming into Dimona and Arad, two cities sitting dangerously close to Israel's own nuclear facility. Nearly 100 people were wounded in a single day. The David's Sling system, Israel's mid-tier interceptor, malfunctioned. 7 waves of Iranian missiles hit Tel Aviv in a single night. Here is the curiosity gap that nobody in the mainstream wanted to explore. How does a destroyed military keep launching ballistic missiles 3 weeks into a war? The answer, if you are willing to look at it honestly, is that the Western assessment of Iran's military capability was catastrophically wrong. Not slightly wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The IRGC had spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario, a full-scale US-Israeli attack. They had dispersed their missile launches, buried their command and control networks, and built redundancy upon redundancy into their retaliatory architecture. The missiles that hit Dimona did not come from the facilities that CENTCOM bombed. They came from somewhere else, somewhere the satellites did not see or chose not to see. This is asymmetric warfare at its most refined. And it is precisely the kind of warfare that empires have always struggled to understand, from Rome's frustrations with Parthia to Napoleon's disaster in Spain to America's own humiliation in Vietnam. You can destroy what you can see, but you cannot destroy what you cannot see, and you certainly cannot destroy an idea, which in this case is the idea of strategic resistance embedded in the DNA of the Islamic Republic. Now let me pull the camera back because this war did not happen in a vacuum. And if you only look at the missiles and the casualties, you miss the real game. The Strait of Hormuz. When the strikes began on February 28th, the IRGC did exactly what every analyst had warned about for 20 years. They moved to close the Strait of Hormuz. Within days, tanker traffic dropped by 70%. By the second week, over 150 ships were anchored outside the strait, afraid to move. Iran attacked at least 21 merchant vessels. Insurance premiums for transiting the strait jumped by 5,000%. That is not a typo. 5,000%. And here is where the war stopped being about Iran and started being about everything. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply and a significant chunk of global LNG trade. When that tap gets turned off, it is not just the Middle East that feels it, it is everyone. Brent crude oil, which had been trading below $65 per barrel at the start of the year, blew past $100, then $126 at its peak, the highest since the 2022 shock. The IEA, in an emergency move, announced a release of 400 million barrels from strategic reserves. Europe, which gets 12 to 14% of its LNG from Qatar through that strait, started staring down the barrel of yet another energy crisis. But here, and this is the part that keeps me up at night, something unprecedented happened. Iran did not close the strait to everyone. They closed it selectively. Chinese ships passed, Indian ships passed, Pakistani ships passed. A Saudi tanker carrying 1 million barrels for India was waved through. Turkish vessels got clearance. Do you see what happened there? Iran, in the middle of a war for its survival, effectively created a 2-tier global shipping system. Friendly nations got passage. Hostile nations did not. The Strait of Hormuz, for the first time in modern history, became a geopolitical sorting mechanism, a physical embodiment of the multipolar order that people like me have been writing about for years. While bombs fell on Tehran, Fujian-class ships sailed through Hormuz. That single image tells you more about the real power dynamics of 2026 than 1,000 Pentagon press briefings, and it gets deeper. Saudi Arabia, watching its eastern export routes choked off, activated the east-west crude oil pipeline at full capacity, diverting oil to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. The UAE routed exports through the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline to Fujairah on the Arabian Sea. These are not temporary fixes. These are structural shifts in global energy infrastructure that will outlast this war by decades. The geography of oil has been permanently redrawn, and the architects of that redrawing were not sitting in boardrooms in Houston or London. They were sitting in Tehran, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Beijing. Now let us talk about the human cost. because behind every geopolitical abstraction, there are bodies. By the time the war reached its 25th day, the Iranian Red Crescent reported over 82,000 civilian structures damaged or destroyed, more than 5,500 residential units, over 1,000 commercial buildings, 14 medical centers, 65 schools, 13 facilities affiliated with the Red Crescent itself. The WHO identified 13 health infrastructure sites hit. A desalination plant on Keshem Island was struck, cutting off clean water supply to an entire population. Reports emerged of prisoners in Evin prison receiving only bread and water. Schools were closed. Cities became ghost towns. People were afraid to go to work. UN human rights experts characterized some of the strikes as potential war crimes under the Rome Statute. The US was reported to have used double-tap airstrikes, hitting a target, waiting for first responders to arrive, then hitting again. This is a tactic that the US government itself has condemned when used by others. And in Israel, the toll was mounting too. Over 4,200 people had been brought to hospitals since the war began. Iranian missiles had struck residential areas in Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, Dimona, Arad. Netanyahu himself said Israel had experienced a very difficult evening in the battle for our future. Hezbollah, which had been observing a fragile ceasefire since 2024, jumped back into the fray, launching rockets and drones into northern Israel and exchanging fire along the Lebanese border. A drone believed to have been launched by Hezbollah even struck a British RAF base in Cyprus. This was not a contained conflict, this was regional conflagration. And in the middle of all this chaos, something remarkable was happening in the diplomatic sphere, or rather in the anti-diplomatic sphere. Trump claimed repeatedly that the US was holding talks with Iran. He said the two sides had reached major points of agreement. He posted about it on social media. He told reporters that Iran means business, and Tehran, officially, emphatically, and with visible anger, denied everything. The IRGC called Trump's claims fake news and a big lie. Parliamentary leaders accused Washington of fabricating stories to manipulate oil markets. One senior military advisor to the new supreme leader said the war would continue until Tehran received full compensation for every bit of damage it had sustained. The oil markets predictably went berserk. Every Trump statement sent prices down. Every Iranian denial sent them back up. Brent crude swung by double-digit percentages in single trading sessions. It was as if the entire global commodity market had been turned into a casino, with the roulette wheel spun by tweets and counter-tweets. And here is where I want you to think about something that goes beyond the daily news cycle. Think about what this means for the structure of global power. For 70 years, the United States maintained a system in which it could project military force anywhere on the planet, overthrow governments at will, and use the dollar as both carrot and stick. That system rested on three pillars: overwhelming military superiority, control of global energy choke points, and the unchallenged dominance of the dollar in international trade. All three pillars are now cracking. The military superiority pillar cracked when Iran demonstrated that it could absorb the heaviest bombardment in modern Middle Eastern history and continue fighting. Not just fighting, striking back effectively. The ballistic missiles that hit Dimona were a message not just to Israel but to every U.S. ally in the region. Your patron's air power cannot protect you from what is coming. The energy choke point pillar cracked when Iran turned the Strait of Hormuz into a selective gateway, demonstrating that the country sitting on the choke point, not the country with the biggest navy, ultimately controls the flow. The U.S. offered naval escorts to tankers. Few takers. The insurance companies, those cold-blooded arbiters of real risk, told the world what the Pentagon would not. The strait was not safe, and no amount of aircraft carriers could change that. And the dollar pillar. That was already cracking before the war started, but the war accelerated the process. When Iran allowed Chinese and Indian ships through Hormuz while blocking Western vessels, it created a de facto preferential trading zone, one denominated not in dollars, but in yuan, rupees, and bilateral agreements. The BRICS nations, watching this unfold, saw their entire de-dollarization thesis validated in real time. China and Russia, which already conduct most of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles, suddenly had the most powerful argument imaginable for expanding that system. The dollar-denominated energy market had just been physically severed by the very military action designed to protect it. This is the supreme irony of the war on Iran. The war that was supposed to demonstrate American power has instead demonstrated the limits of American power. The war that was supposed to secure energy flows has disrupted them on a scale not seen since the 1970s. And the war that was supposed to eliminate a threat to the regional order has instead created a new regional order, one in which Iran, even battered and bloodied, has proven that it cannot be erased. Let me now bring us back to Mojtaba Khamenei, because his ascension is not just a footnote. It is the key to understanding what comes next. Mojtaba grew up inside the system. He did not come to power through a coup or through popular revolution. He came to power through the constitutional mechanism that the Islamic Republic created for exactly this scenario: leadership transition under fire, and the speed and discipline with which that transition occurred tells us something crucial. The Iranian system is more institutionally resilient than anyone in the West imagined, but Mojtaba faces a paradox. He inherits a country that has demonstrated extraordinary military resilience and geopolitical leverage, but also a country whose cities are being systematically destroyed, whose civilians are suffering catastrophically, and whose economy, already weakened by years of sanctions, is being pushed to breaking point. The infrastructure damage alone will take years, possibly decades, to repair. The question is whether the legitimacy gained through resistance can be converted into the legitimacy needed for reconstruction. And here is the question that will define Iran's next chapter. Can a regime that proved it can survive a war also prove it can survive the peace that follows? Because history is full of examples where the answer was no. The Soviet Union survived World War II, but the seeds of its eventual collapse were planted in the very victory that saved it. Nasser's Egypt survived the Suez Crisis, but the real challenges came afterward, in the slow erosion of revolutionary promise. The question for Mojtaba is whether he can navigate between the hardliners who want perpetual confrontation and the broader population that has been protesting for years, protesting for economic relief, for social freedoms, for the basic infrastructure of a functioning modern state. The protests that erupted in early 2026, before the war even started, motivated by a struggling economy and decaying infrastructure, were a warning. They were put down with force, but the grievances did not disappear. They were merely deferred by the war. And when the war ends, if it ends, those grievances will return, amplified by the devastation. Now let me zoom out one more time, because the Iran war did not just reshape the Middle East. It reshuffled every major geopolitical relationship on the planet. Start with China. While bombs fell on Tehran, Beijing was playing the longest game on the board. Since the start of 2026, foreign leaders from across Asia, the Americas, and Europe visited China in rapid succession. The British Prime Minister went to Beijing, the first such visit in 8 years. Canada's Prime Minister signed a trade cooperation roadmap. South Korea's president shook hands with a Chinese humanoid robot at a startup summit in Shanghai. China launched its 15th five-year plan, centered on technological self-reliance and high-quality development. And through the Strait of Hormuz, Chinese ships sailed freely. Beijing's message to the world was not delivered in speeches or communiques, it was delivered in shipping lanes. While the US was spending billions bombing Iran and failing to reopen the strait, China was getting its oil delivered on schedule, signing trade deals with Western nations fleeing the chaos, and positioning itself as the indispensable hub of the new global economy. The APEC 2026 summit, hosted by China, became less a forum for trade liberalization and more a showcase for an alternative world order, one where the host nation does not bomb its way to relevance, but builds its way there. Russia, for its part, watched the Iran war with a mixture of solidarity and strategic calculation. The China-Russia joint statement on AI governance, opposing the weaponization of technology and the politicization of supply chains, was a direct shot at Washington's chip embargo strategy. Putin and Xi spoke on the first day of the Chinese Lunar New Year, in what Xinhua called an extraordinary example of China's diplomacy. The message was clear: the Eurasian partnership is not a reaction to Western policy, it is a parallel civilization. And then there is the global South, the silent majority of the planet that Western media barely covers. BRICS, now expanded to include Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE, watched the war and drew its conclusions. Every missile that hit Tehran was an advertisement for de-dollarization. Every ship turned away from Hormuz was a case study in why alternative trade routes and alternative currencies are not luxuries but necessities. The yuan oil futures contract, the BRICS payment framework, the discussions about a gold-backed currency, all of these moved from theoretical to urgent in the span of a month. Here is the thing about empires, and I say this as someone who has studied them across 3 continents. Empires do not fall because of a single defeat. They fall because a single defeat reveals the structural weaknesses that everyone had been too afraid to name. The Strait of Hormuz crisis did not create the cracks in American hegemony. It revealed them. It showed that the US military can destroy, but it cannot control. It showed that the dollar system works only as long as the physical infrastructure of global trade remains intact, and that the US itself can destroy that infrastructure through its own military adventures. It showed that the nations of the global south are not passive observers but active players, waiting for exactly this kind of moment to accelerate their exit from a system they never chose. Let me bring it home. As I record this, the war is still going. Iranian missiles are still flying. American bombs are still falling. Trump is claiming negotiations while Tehran denies them. Oil prices are swinging like a pendulum in a hurricane. A 15-point ceasefire proposal has reportedly been sent to Iran, and whether it leads to peace or to another round of escalation remains genuinely unknown. But some things are already clear, regardless of how the war ends. First, Iran has demonstrated that regime decapitation does not work against a system that was designed to survive it. The speed of Mojtaba Khamenei's ascension proved that the Islamic Republic is not a one-man show. It is a deeply institutionalized system with layers of redundancy. You can hate it, you can criticize it, but you cannot deny its organizational resilience under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Second, the Strait of Hormuz gambit revealed the true vulnerability of the global energy system, not to Iranian aggression, but to the interdependence that decades of globalization created and that military action can rupture in an afternoon. The selective passage system, friendly ships pass, hostile ships do not, may become a template for future conflicts. If so, the very concept of freedom of navigation, which has been a cornerstone of the American-led order since 1945, will need to be fundamentally renegotiated. Third, the war accelerated every trend that was already reshaping the global order: de-dollarization, the rise of BRICS, the technological decoupling between the US and China, the energy diversification of the Gulf states, and the growing irrelevance of European strategic autonomy. None of these trends started with the Iran war, but the war compressed decades of gradual change into a matter of weeks. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, the human cost of this war is a moral stain that no amount of geopolitical analysis can wash away. Over 82,000 civilian structures destroyed, thousands dead, children killed in schools adjacent to military targets, a desalination plant bombed, leaving an island without clean water, hospitals hit, double tap strikes on first responders. This is not collateral damage. This is the architecture of collective punishment, and history will judge it accordingly. So what comes next? I do not know. Nobody does. That is the honest answer, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But I know this: the map of the Middle East has been redrawn, not by diplomats in Geneva or generals in the Pentagon, but by missiles and counter-missiles, by oil tankers and insurance premiums, by a young supreme leader inheriting his father's war and his father's enemies, and by the quiet, relentless strategic patience of nations that have been waiting for this moment for decades. The question that remains is the question that will define not just the Middle East, but the entire 21st century, is this: when the smoke clears over Tehran, will the world that emerges still be the world that Washington designed? Or will it be something else entirely, something that was already being born in the shipping lanes of Hormuz, in the corridors of BRICS summits, in the fiber optic cables connecting Shanghai to Sao Paulo? I suspect we already know the answer. We are just not ready to say it out loud.